Every once in a while on this channel, I hit a game that just stops me cold. Not because I have nothing to say about it, but because I have way too much to say. With the whole premise of this series being that I have to talk about every game I play, I'm used to covering titles that are a little bland, a little forgettable, or just not worth a 20-minute deep dive. Oftentimes for my videos, those games get paired with other bigger games or folded into compilations. But then there's the other extreme. The big ones. A game so interesting, so layered, so incredibly important, that I feel weirdly intimidated even trying to talk about them. It's happened a few times so far. Final Fantasy IV, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger, to name a few, but none of them hit me with the same kind of writer's paralysis as this one. Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear 1 and 2 were among some of the first games I covered on this channel about 3 years ago, and while I do still enjoy and respect both those games, Metal Gear Solid just feels like an entirely different beast. It represented a watershed moment in the industry, a tectonic shift in how games could present characters, deliver story, create atmosphere, and even critique the player. It's widely considered one of the best PlayStation titles ever made, and the level of refinement and ambition here set a standard that the series would ride for at least 15 years. At one point in my life, for many years in a row, Metal Gear wasn't just one of my favorite franchises. It was my favorite franchise. And while this wasn't technically the first game in the series, it absolutely was the one that pushed Hideo Kojima's strange, cinematic, hyper-specific style into the global spotlight. But for all its revolutionary qualities and its almost mythic reputation, Metal Gear Solid is still a video game, one with limitations, quirks, flaws, eccentricities, and moments where its ambition maybe outpaces its execution. And that's what makes it such a fascinating work to explore today. When Hideo Kojima began developing Metal Gear Solid, even with the stated goal of making, quote, the best PlayStation game ever, neither he nor the higher-ups at Konami expected a massive hit. The franchise had been dormant for 6 years, and the name Metal Gear was little more than a footnote. The series' mainline entries had been trapped on the Japan-only MSX2, and while the NES games had a modest following in the West, they were remembered mostly as curiosities. Most people who played MGS in 1998 assumed it was the start of a brand new series. Honestly, a lot of people still do. Coincidentally, the same day I was writing this script, I had to clarify on Reddit that when I said Metal Gear Solid is Metal Gear 3, I wasn't talking about Metal Gear Solid 3. Part of this confusion was by design. Kojima deliberately avoided calling the game Metal Gear 3 because he didn't want newcomers to feel unwelcome. MGS was shaped in the wake of Policenauts, itself a spiritual successor to Snatcher, and it marked the first time Kojima served not just as director, but as producer. That meant full control. Platform, budget, staff, marketing, everything. Initially, the game was even planned for the ill-fated 3DO before Kojima was seduced by the sweet siren song of the PlayStation. At first, he put almost no thought into how to market the game. None of his prior work had been mainstream, not even the earlier Metal Gear entries. Snatcher was probably his most famous title, and even that only had a devoted cult audience. Kojima simply expected his small, loyal fanbase to return, and not much else. And Konami at large seemed to agree. That all changed when the initial Metal Gear Solid trailers at TGS 96 and E3 97 landed with an overwhelmingly positive reception, especially among Western audiences. This wasn't something anyone at Konami, not even Kojima himself, had seriously anticipated. Metal Gear Solid was reviving a franchise most players barely knew existed. Yes, Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 had laid the groundwork a decade earlier, but they were far from mainstream fixtures. The original Metal Gear survived on the NES mostly as a curiosity, an oddball stealth experiment remembered by a small scattered circle of players, many of whom didn't even realize that it was a heavily altered version of Kojima's actual vision. Metal Gear 2, meanwhile, remained exclusive to the MSX2, a platform practically invisible outside Japan. By the time the PlayStation era arrived, Metal Gear wasn't a legacy IP so much as a historical footnote. So the idea that this obscure, inconsistent lineage could suddenly surge back to life as one of the defining multimedia franchises of the next 2 decades was genuinely shocking. For the few who did remember the MSX games, the revival felt like an unexpected gift. This weird Cold War-entrenched series was getting a prestige big-budget comeback, and in such a stylish, cinematic way. How would a franchise so rooted in 80s anxieties find a new identity in the late 90s? Meanwhile, newcomers viewed the trailers with fresh eyes and saw something wholly different. An action game with layers, mystery, and an emotional texture video games weren't expected to have. The warmth of that early reception reshaped the project virtually overnight. What had begun as a relatively small-scale niche passion effort suddenly ballooned into a full-blown blockbuster event, one of the most anticipated releases of its era. Konami rapidly expanded the development team to over 100 people and poured more than $8 million into marketing alone. The game's targeted 1997 release date was pushed into 1998 to ensure the final product met its newly massive expectations. Konami knew they had something special on their hands, and they weren't about to let the opportunity slip away. And when Metal Gear Solid launched in September 1998, it didn't just meet expectations, it obliterated them. Critic response was overwhelmingly positive, sales were exceptional, and it was a consistent presence in that year's awards circuit, which is especially impressive considering that 1998 was a really good year for games. Absurdly good. An actual embarrassment of riches. You had Resident Evil 2, Banjo-Kazooie, Half-Life, StarCraft Brood War, Ocarina of Time, Grim Fandango, Thief. It's one of those years where even the B-tier releases are now remembered as classics. And on the film side, the late 90s blockbuster machine was in full swing. Titanic had just shattered box office records. Saving Private Ryan and The Truman Show were redefining genre expectations. Action cinema was loud, expensive, and testosterone-soaked, with Hollywood in the middle of its prestige popcorn phase. Metal Gear Solid launched in the middle of this cultural soup, and what Kojima tried to do, essentially, was beat Hollywood at its own game, using the tools of interactive media rather than just imitating cinema outright.
It's been a long time, Snake.
I should have known you were behind this, Colonel.
Story-wise, Metal Gear Solid picks up 6 years after Metal Gear 2, in 2005. Snake and Campbell have retired from Foxhound, but are forced back into action when the new Foxhound members hijack a nuclear disposal facility in Alaska and threaten global catastrophe. Snake has to rescue 2 high-profile hostages, the chief of the real-life military organization, DARPA, and the president of fictional arms manufacturer ArmsTech. Along the way, he'll receive help from Campbell's niece, Meryl, and uncover conspiracies, betrayals, morally tangled motivations, and, yes, another Metal Gear prototype. While the story is accessible to newcomers, it also hinges on events from Metal Gear 2, a game that was never released outside Japan. America got Snake's Revenge instead, a completely unrelated game not directed by Kojima and wholly outside of the series' overall canon. The main menu of MGS provides text recaps of Metal Gear 1 and 2, but the disconnect between regions meant that for many players, MGS might as well have been the first entry. That obscurity ironically gave Hideo Kojima something invaluable: freedom. With few players familiar enough with the MSX2 games to complain, Metal Gear Solid could reinvent the series' continuity with almost no friction. The result is a game that both inherits and rewrites its own past, often in major ways. The most famous example is the reveal that Big Boss, previously just the generic mustache-twirling supervillain of the earlier games, was now Solid Snake's biological father. Neither the original Metal Gear nor Metal Gear 2 had any sort of Darth Vader-esque reveal, nor is one ever even implied to have happened off-screen. It's a dramatic retcon, one that fundamentally reshapes the emotional landscape of both titles. Yet because so few players had experienced Metal Gear 2, this bombshell landed not as a contradiction, but as a natural escalation of the story's stakes. Even broader narrative rewrites slipped through the cracks with similar ease. Metal Gear 2's core premise had hinged on a world where nuclear weapons had been effectively abolished, an optimistic premise that Metal Gear Solid not only entirely discards, but openly contradicts. Here, the world is said to be in the exact opposite situation, with so many leftover and unused nukes that we've literally run out of safe places to store and dismantle them. In the game's near-future setting, nukes are not only still around, they're treated as a geopolitical inevitability. Rather than worrying about their eradication, the story warns about the terrifying institutional machinery that protects them. A contradiction, absolutely, but in 1998, nearly no one knew enough to care. Kojima could reshape the thematic framework of the franchise to suit the ambitious cinematic tone he wanted to strike. These changes weren't arbitrary. They served the new game's themes and philosophies about genetic destiny, geopolitics, and post-Cold War identity. Kojima was smart in choosing which continuity details to keep, which to bend, and which to reshape entirely. This is art prioritizing expression over lore, as I believe most great art should. It's a fascinating paradox. Metal Gear Solid is both a revival and a soft reboot, a continuation of games most of its audience never played, and a reinvention bold enough to define an entirely new identity. Far from being anchored by its sequestered lineage, the game used that obscurity as a springboard, liberating itself from the expectations that normally constrain sequels. In retrospect, it's one of the great strokes of luck in gaming history, a franchise malleable enough to let its creator rewrite its DNA, yet sturdy enough to launch a cultural phenomenon. As much as fans like to rag on the later entries for their supposed abundance of retcons, this is something Kojima's been doing since the beginning, and almost always in service of the story he was trying to tell.
It's Snake. I'm in front of the disposal facility.
Excellent, Snake. Age hasn't slowed you down one bit.
And make no mistake, Metal Gear Solid is a story. From the moment you start a new game, you're greeted with opening credits that play over the gameplay, something almost unheard of in 1998 when most games didn't even bother with opening credits at all. And this is just the first of many cinematic flourishes that make MGS feel like a movie you happen to be playing. With the exception of a few grainy stock footage clips, and Kojima will not be letting up on those anytime soon, every narrative beat unfolds in-engine, allowing scenes to flow seamlessly into and out of player control. Because each room is a literal stage, Kojima's team famously prototyped all of them with Lego to experiment with angles and blocking, the line between level design and set design blurs in a way few games had even attempted. And, okay, sure, the codec calls are basically just glorified text boxes, and that can break the immersion a bit, but every single line of dialogue in this game is fully voiced, with no exceptions. That commitment is probably why the game spans 2 discs despite its relatively short length, but it's also a major contributor to how deeply immersive Shadow Moses feels. Every cutscene, radio call, guard encounter, and incidental moment is performed by an actor. And beyond the scripted story, there are hundreds of optional codec conversations to uncover. In my Metal Gear 2 video, I described that game's writing as almost akin to a point-and-click adventure or a visual novel, full of context-sensitive text the player can poke at for extra detail. Metal Gear Solid adopts the same philosophy, but scales it up dramatically. The level of conditional dialogue borders on absurd, and I know this because I compiled it all on Game FAQs years ago. See this? Yeah, that's me. That's my name up there. I'm the one who contributed this doc. There are hundreds of unique codec calls that activate depending on where Snake is standing, what he's holding, what he did last, or the path he took to get here. Optional conversations aren't just cute flavor text either. They're character development, exposition, jokes at Snake's expense, and even mechanical hints. It's all ancillary, all player-driven, and all specifically engineered to be something a movie could never deliver.
Snake, you're not using a stereo TV?
It can't be. A mono TV. Well, Colonel, there's nothing we can do about it.
I guess you're right. Snake, don't worry about it. There's more to being a good person than just having a stereo television. You can do it just the way you are.
Where Kojima truly shines, though, is in weaving those cinematic ambitions directly into the gameplay and leveraging every hardware quirk the PlayStation has to offer. Every button on the controller, yes, even the oft-neglected select button, has gameplay relevance, and the game makes full use of the DualShock's analog inputs and rumble features. Vibration becomes a storytelling tool, accompanying gunfire, explosions, and moments of physical stress, like mimicking Meryl's pulse or a character's heart attack. At one point, a character even uses the controller to massage Snake's arm after a brutal button-mashing torture sequence, a sequence where Ocelot claims he can detect turbo controllers.
Don't even think about using auto fire, or I'll know.
He's bluffing, of course, but the fact Kojima even thought of that says everything. And then there's Psycho Mantis. No other moment better showcases MGS's fascination with breaking the fourth wall and exploiting console hardware in service of narrative. Snake faces a psychic who can read your mind, which the game manifests by openly reading your controller inputs. To beat him, you must do the unthinkable. Unplug your controller and switch to port 2. Even then, the team accounted for contingencies. If you die during the fight, the game assumes that the second port is unusable and offers an alternate solution. Before you even reach that fight, Mantis has already been messing with you, critiquing your playstyle, counting your game overs, shaking your controller telekinetically, faking a TV input switch, and, most memorably, reading your memory card to comment on other Konami games you've played.
So, you like Suikoden?
For many players, this was a moment of genuine shock. Memory cards were still relatively new, and the idea that one game could inspect the contents of another game felt almost supernatural. Mantis's routine remains one of gaming's great fourth wall shatterings, and something fundamentally rooted in interactivity. Moreover, it's a completely different flavor of immersion than what we associate with modern AAA games. Today, immersion is usually defined as the player forgetting that they're playing a game at all, an attempt to dissolve the screen entirely. Metal Gear Solid goes in the opposite direction. In the Psycho Mantis fight, the game forces you to confront the physical reality of the experience, to recognize that you're just tapping buttons on a hunk of plastic in front of a TV. It's immersion through self-awareness, an approach that feels almost radical compared to the hyper-realism that dominates big-budget games today. Even the late-game plot twist that the villains had been nudging Snake towards success the entire time so he'd unwittingly further their agenda functions like a commentary on game design itself. Designers obviously want players to progress rather than fail. MGS simply folds that idea back into the fiction, making the story's manipulations feel like an extension of the player's own experience. It's clever, self-aware, and uniquely suited to the medium, the kind of interactive cinema a film simply couldn't pull off.
Oh, that's right. It should be on the back of the CD case. Try to contact her.
And that's the truly clever thing about Hideo Kojima's design philosophies. He's not trying to make games as movies. He's not trying to have games replacing movies. He's creating games using cinematic language to express ideas that no movie could. MGS is not a movie disguised as a game. It's a game that understands cinema and then weaponizes that understanding to make the gameplay hit harder. Metal Gear Solid's attention to detail extends beyond its cinematic flair and deep into the mechanics themselves. Guards can spot and follow your footprints in the snow.
Whose footprints are these?
Your own stun grenades will blind you if you're looking toward the flash. Wolf Pea can mask Snake's scent, keeping the dogs themselves docile. Rations freeze if you linger outdoors too long and can then be thawed using Snake's body heat, or even a bathroom hand dryer. Snake can even catch the guards cold during the prison escape if you put the man in a chokehold, and the resulting sneezes might give away your position. Details like these demonstrate that realism isn't achieved through graphical fidelity, although the game certainly has that too, but through systems that behave in believable, surprising ways. Even Snake's equipment reinforces this. Aside from the fanciful Nikita missiles and the exaggerated qualities of the Kodak and Soliton radar, nearly every item and weapon he uses is grounded in real-world military tech, keeping the game's universe just plausible enough to feel tactile. The attention to detail isn't just novelty either, it's a philosophy. Games should feel alive because interaction is what sets them apart from movies. And that philosophy reaches its most pointed moment with Liquid's accusation near the end. When he criticizes Snake's bloodlust, the scene is framed so that he's staring through the screen. Not at Snake, but at you.
So why are you here then? Why do you continue to follow your orders while your superiors betray you? You enjoy all the killing. That's why.
What?
Are you denying it? Haven't you already killed most of my comrades?
This only works because you pulled the trigger. If this were a film, this accusation would have no teeth. Directly accusing a film audience of being addicted to violence wouldn't work, since the audience's role in the carnage is passive. But in the context of a video game, it does work. By a video game's very nature, the player willingly and actively played a role in Snake's actions. Even today, games struggle to integrate morality into gameplay this effectively. And MGS reinforces that moral dimension everywhere else. The game's anti-nuclear messaging, present through Kodak conversations, environmental cues, and plot revelations, was unusually pointed for a late 90s action game. More notably, the mechanics actively support a non-lethal approach. Non-lethal takedowns are viable, encouraged, and even rewarded. The ranking system at the end tallies your kills and scores you higher the fewer bodies you leave behind. The message is embedded not just in the cutscenes, but in the rule of play itself.
Can you talk?
Who are you?
I'm not one of them.
But of course, the game's story would be impossible to take seriously if it weren't for the absolutely stellar English script and cast. The English version of Metal Gear Solid wasn't just good for its time, it was exceptional and set a new gold standard entirely. Jeremy Blaustein's localization was unusually polished, naturalistic, and tonally consistent for 1998. He didn't go with a straight translation, but adapted it into something that sounded like Hollywood thriller dialogue, rather than a literal word-for-word port of Japanese text. Blostein also translated the optional briefing files and even the game's absolutely massive 56-page instruction manual, which helped keep the game's dense terminology consistent. He's also responsible for coining iconic franchise vocabulary like codec or OSP. And then there's the voice acting, another massive leap forward. Unless you were playing a LucasArts game, Metal Gear Solid had easily the most professional quality English voice cast of any video game of the time. And they're all directed wonderfully by Chris Zimmerman, a veteran of the voiceover industry. David Hayter delivers a defining performance as Solid Snake.
I'm just a man who's good at what he does, killing. There's no winning or losing for a mercenary. The only winners in war are the people.
Cam Clarke's performance as Liquid delightfully balances the flamboyant with the unhinged.
Now I'll finish the work that Father began. I will surpass him. I will destroy him.
And Paul Eiding's Colonel Campbell is astonishingly grounded and sincere.
Bust out of there and get to the communications tower. Also,
What?
I know it's asking a lot.
Meryl, right?
Yeah,
I'll save her.
thanks.
Looking back, sure, some of these fakey accents can be kinda cheesy, but the quality of the performances themselves elevated what could easily have been camp and made it into something truly iconic. This game was also one of the first to really prop up its voice actors, crediting them in-screen as their characters show up. Voiceover work, especially back then, could be a somewhat thankless job, and this was one of the first big examples of a project treating its voiceover artists with the same attention a live-action star would receive. And it's all reinforced by an unforgettable soundtrack that blends echoing orchestral elements with lonely, almost sinister ambience, giving the game an undercurrent of dread that occasionally pushes it into light horror territory. The alert theme is a burst of tense, frantic energy, while the cutscenes lean on dynamic, Hollywood-style compositions that elevate their cinematic weight. And then there's the ending vocal track, The Best Is Yet to Come, whose operatic Gaelic lyrics are as haunting as they are beautiful. The result is a musical identity that feels wholly singular. Combine that with Yoji Shinkawa's surreal, almost shapeless artwork, and you have something truly one of a kind. No other game looks or sounds quite like Metal Gear Solid.
What did our president do? If the terrorists launched that thing...
Metal Gear Solid's narrative is part political thriller, part sci-fi melodrama, part anti-nuke sermon, and part Sunday morning anime. In other words, it is extremely Kojima. Within this story, you get genetic determinism, Cold War mythologizing, philosophizing about nuclear deterrence, asymmetry theory, and very pseudo-scientific jargon about recessive genes, as well as long monologues about war, identity, and fate. It's compelling, it's audacious, but it can also be preachy. Sometimes really preachy.
I was born and raised in Pripyat, Ukraine. I was 10 years old on that day, Chernobyl. That is the day that changed my life and thousands of other lives. Where 605,000 children suffered the effects of Radiation 86 in 1993. 12,000 children died. Must rid this world of all nuclear weapons before they cause more misery. Not allow this pain and anxiety to pass on to yet another.
I get it!
And the game's cutscenes? They are numerous, they are long, they stop the action frequently. Metal Gear Solid games are often derided as being more movie than game, and while I feel that's a somewhat reductive take, that criticism isn't exactly misplaced either. Even in 1998, reviewers noticed the imbalance between playing and watching. Despite the game's tremendous legacy, it wasn't uncommon to hear or read comments about the length of the game's cutscenes, or the self-righteousness of its script. A first-time playthrough will probably last around 10 hours, at least 4 of which are cutscenes. As bold as the game's story could be, the dialogue often lacked subtlety or restraint.
I was a fool. I wanted to be a soldier. But war is ugly. There's nothing glamorous about it.
But for many players, that self-indulgence is part of the charm. This is one of the first times a big-budget game felt like a personal auteurist work. And even when the writing takes a turn toward the self-important, its earnestness keeps it compelling.
Okay, hero. Set me free.
Goodbye.
As some of you may have already noticed, I've spent a lot of time discussing Metal Gear Solid's story and presentation, and far less time talking about its nuts and bolts gameplay, and, well, that's partly because there really is less to say on a fundamental design level. Much of MGS's core gameplay sensibilities were already established in the earlier entries, particularly Metal Gear 2. Just as Final Fantasy VII builds on design principles laid down by Final Fantasy VI, and just as Ocarina of Time would later echo the structure of A Link to the Past, Metal Gear Solid borrows extensively from its immediate predecessor as well. This wasn't at all unusual for the era. In the early days of 3D game development, studios were still learning how to orient themselves in a new dimension, and many franchises opted for a don't break what already works approach. They took proven 2D concepts and translated them into 3D as faithfully as possible, essentially doing a one-to-one adaptation of established mechanics. MGS is very much part of that lineage, evolutionary rather than revolutionary in its moment-to-moment design, even as its presentation and cinematic ambitions pushed the medium in bold new directions. That's one aspect of Metal Gear Solid that often gets overlooked, at least by players who never touched the MSX originals. That is just how closely it echoes Metal Gear 2. While MGS is usually framed as a groundbreaking leap forward, the leap is built on a remarkably sturdy template. Nearly every major concept that players celebrated in '98, radar-driven stealth, sound-based enemy behavior, crawling, luring guards with noise, codec-driven storytelling, all had already been prototyped in surprisingly modern form via Metal Gear 2. In many ways, MGS plays like a fully realized, high-fidelity interpretation of that design philosophy. What happens when you take Metal Gear 2's systems, give them a 3D space, add in-engine cutscenes, and polish the moment-to-moment movement until it feels smooth rather than experimental. The result is more evolutionary than purely iterative, and in some beats, almost reverently so. Where the similarities become especially striking is in the story structure. Many of MGS's most memorable twists and set pieces mirror moments directly lifted or reimagined from MG2. Infiltrating the first building via the vent ducts, a character from the prior game returning as a cyborg ninja, a female ally disguising herself as an enemy soldier and meeting up with Snake in the ladies' restroom, a battle with a Hind-D helicopter using Stinger missiles, fleeing up a long spiral staircase while being chased by an endless stream of guards, an ambush by 4 soldiers in an elevator, a mysterious anonymous radio contact who warns Snake of upcoming traps, who in both instances turns out to be Gray Fox. All of these moments are shared between these two games. Because of these parallels, some critics and fans have described Metal Gear Solid as a pseudo-remake of Metal Gear 2, and that label isn't entirely unwarranted. Kojima wasn't shy about revisiting the earlier game's strongest moments, polishing them until they felt definitive. But calling MGS simply a remake undersells what it does accomplish. It doesn't just restage Metal Gear 2's ideas, it recontextualizes them. Scenes that were once communicated through text boxes and 8-bit sprites gain emotional weight through performance, pacing, and voice direction. Themes that felt sketched in the MSX era, such as the ethics of soldiering, the tension between technological progress and political morality, are brought into sharper focus through MGS's cinematic sensibility. The structure may be familiar, but the tone and implications are dramatically richer. Ultimately, the resemblance between the two games says less about MGS's derivativeness and more about how advanced Metal Gear 2 really was. Kojima used MGS not to overwrite his earlier vision, but to finally deliver on it, with the resources, hardware, and talent it always needed. That's why the pseudo-remake label lands. The beats are familiar, the skeleton recognizable, but the body is wholly transformed. In expanding Metal Gear 2 into a PlayStation-era showcase, Metal Gear Solid illustrates how continuity, iteration, and reinvention can coexist, creating something that feels at once new and inevitable. But even beyond the narrative parallels, it's difficult to ignore that Metal Gear Solid, despite being a 3D game in a literal technical sense, often plays remarkably like a 2D game from 8 years earlier. In some respects, I'd even argue that the 2D iteration handled certain elements more cleanly. Kojima recognized during development that many fully 3D games of the era were saddled with clumsy, imprecise controls, so he deliberately chose to maintain a largely 2D design language while rendering everything with 3D models. And while that design choice is totally understandable, it introduces its own set of limitations. Most notably, the camera is frequently far too tight, which makes it easy for players to be blindsided by enemies lurking just off-screen. As a result, players often end up relying on Snake's somewhat unreliable auto-aim to hit their intended targets. In practice, the real gameplay often takes place on the Soliton radar. Your actual situational awareness lives in that little corner of the screen. That said, I do appreciate how the item and weapon inventories function as early prototypes of the modern weapon wheel, probably the single smoothest and most forward-thinking piece of UI design in the entire game. Structurally, Metal Gear Solid is also far more linear than its rich detail might initially suggest. Snake's infiltration is essentially just a straight line with occasional detours. But the actual world layout is tight and controlled, if sometimes restricted. The upside to this is that the experience is meticulously paced from beginning to end. The downside is that it lacks the long-term exploration depth you'd find in a Resident Evil or a Metroid. And this ties into a larger criticism. The difficulty curve is weirdly front-loaded. Snake starts with a tiny health bar, and much like Resident Evil 2, the game's best-designed areas are stacked at the front. The opening infiltration, the tank hangar, the heliport, these are the stealth sandboxes. But once you reach the communications tower, the variety shrinks and the stealth becomes sparse. The late game leans heavily on boss encounters. Most of them are excellent, but it still shifts the balance away from the systems that made the opening hours so rich. Then there's the backtracking. Seriously, f*** this PAL card. The final stretch forces you to run back and forth multiple times for what feels like no purpose other than padding the runtime and giving the story room to monologue its way toward the finale. In a game built on detail and immersion, the late game linearity stands out. In a game with intricate looping maps, backtracking works, but in a mostly linear game like Metal Gear Solid, it's tolerable at best and infuriating at worst. Against all of that, though, Metal Gear Solid still stood out. A tactical espionage action game with a fixed top-down camera in a year where the industry was obsessed with full 3D mobility. A game that blended action with pacifism, melodrama with political thriller, cinematic techniques with a deeply mechanical play. A game that, in many ways, felt like it had arrived from 10 years in the future. When Kojima and his team began work on Metal Gear Solid, they set one central goal: to make the best PlayStation game ever. And depending on who you ask, they did just that. Metal Gear Solid is not perfect. The pacing has issues, the backtracking is clunky, the cutscenes can be long-winded, and the narrative sometimes confuses melodrama for profundity. But all of that just adds to the charm. The game is undeniably astonishingly ambitious, and shockingly successful at most of what it attempts. And what makes it special today isn't just that it changed video games as drastically as it did, it's that so much of the game still works. The fixed camera feels intentional rather than dated, and ironically caused it to age much better than a lot of other early 3D games. The stealth gameplay is still engaging even if it isn't particularly deep. It still has things to say about war, violence, and player complicity. The voice acting still holds up extremely well, and it has enough tiny hidden details that you can still discover something new on your second, third, even 10th playthrough. Metal Gear Solid is a brilliant contradiction, a game limited by its era yet somehow timeless, earnest to a fault but also remarkably self-aware, hyperlinear but endlessly replayable and completely unforgettable. It is a turning point for the medium, a bold declaration of what games could be, and even if parts of it show their age, the vision behind it remains ageless. Even if you've never played Metal Gear Solid, even if you only know the memes, Jack, its fingerprints are on everything. The ripple effect it caused continues to be seen today in UI design, stealth mechanics, boss philosophy, environmental storytelling, and how games play with player expectations. And while Kojima didn't invent the auteur model, Metal Gear Solid was the first time a Western mainstream audience really noticed who was directing their video games. Metal Gear Solid is one of those rare games that feels like it arrived fully formed, yet also impossible. It was too ambitious for its hardware, too cinematic for its era, too philosophical for its audience, and too mechanically weird to be imitated wholesale. And yet, it worked. More than that, it changed everything. And maybe that's why it took me so long to write this script, because talking about Metal Gear Solid isn't hard. What's hard is saying anything that feels worthy of it.